All right. Welcome everyone to the final part of the On Violence experimental study sequence for fall 2024. I'm grateful for everybody who's coming through. I'm especially grateful to our very welcomed and honored guest, my longtime friend and comrade, Damien Sojoyner. I've known Damien for 20 plus years, since he was a kid, since he was a grad student. I remember that's when I met you. I think I met you in an office at University of Texas with Joel, right?
That's right. That's right. Yep.
That's right. That's right. You were young back then. So was I. So I've known Damien for 20 plus years. There are 1,000 different ways I could introduce him, but I'll say that for the purposes of today's discussion, I think it's important to recognize how this work, his previous book, Joy and Pain, and actually to a big extent his first book, First Strike, are in every way directly related to the role he plays as president of the board of Southern California Library. And I will say that he is the author of a field-shaping book, First Strike, Educational Enclosures in Black LA. His book previous to this one is a book called Joy and Pain, a story of Black life and liberation in 5 albums. As I told the group that was here earlier, that text was the focus of, I think, a very similar experimental study group that Damien, Yusuf Omawale, Michelle Welsing, and I facilitated in 2023, early 2023. And then the last thing I'll say is that I will owe Damien forever, because he and another close friend of ours, Professor Connie One, were the ones that introduced me to, I think, a completely rupturing, radical critique of what was then the still emerging nonprofit liberal anthropic concept of the school to prison pipeline, something that's actually become fully operationalized and institutionalized in almost every aspect of civil society, but especially colleges and universities, right? You hear the phrase school to prison pipeline everywhere. Thanks to Damien and thanks to Connie, I now can't say that phrase, because what he and Connie helped me understand is how it is that the liberal teleology of school to prison pipeline compartmentalizes the forms of carcerality. We're talking about carceral archive today. Compartmentalize the forms of carcerality, of policing, of warfare that actually happen at the site of the school. So Damien has been, in my mind, a scholar, intellectual, researcher, teacher who's on the insurrectionist end of the abolitionist Black radical spectrum, and is also, I think, an unapologetic critical analyst and righteous enemy of all the forms of academic liberalism that seep into these discussions and seep into nonprofit and extra academic and extra university discussions as well. So I'm going to give you all a link to the event in which Damien Sojoyner and Connie One presented on this concept of school to prison pipeline. It was 11 years ago, and we still look the same. So there it is in the YouTube right there. I'll put it in the, for those folks who are watching us in the YouTube, I'll put it in the YouTube comments at some point too. But Damien, welcome. Thank you for coming through. We had 4 co-facilitators help kind of frame the book for us before you came through. I'm going to actually just go through each of them and ask them to kind of stoke our discussion at the beginning. And all the other folks who are here in attendance, please don't hesitate to raise your Zoom hand. We're going to spend the best time we possibly can in the next 71 minutes with Damien. As you all know, this is an unscripted, open conversation, and what the book we read today is Damien's most recent book, Against the Carceral Archive, The Art of Black Liberatory Practice. So let me start by calling on Jackie. We'll go from Jackie to Kim to Susie to Jesse, and then we'll kind of open up the floor from there. And with apologies, I will very likely interject with a comment and a question here and there just because I can't help myself. I'm going to start with you, Jackie.
Hi, Damien, thank you so much for being here for this ridiculous timeout. Really loved reading your book, really enjoyed a lot about it. I think particularly the reading in the introduction, the selection about the fugitive library, that actual reading. One of the things that I mentioned in the first half of our seminar was how moved I was by reading that and seeing that so clearly articulated. I think it's just kind of a reminder to me that like part of the utility of like these sorts of spaces are being able to find those little like nuggets of fugitivity and kind of clearly articulated political orientations that can like fuel us all over. So really appreciated including that. I think the other thing too quickly before I say my question, I really appreciated the section towards the end where you were writing about the spectacle and how the spectacle of the grotesque or the extreme like state violence functions. I'm based in St. Louis and was organizing a lot during the Ferguson Uprising in 2014 and have been organizing a lot over the past year around Palestine in St. Louis. And so seeing the way that like the 2014 version of the uprising and what came out of it or didn't come out of that period, what sort of radical revolutionary potential that might have been nurtured in that moment, how that was used to expand the state, expand logics, policing logics, expand the nonprofit infrastructure in St. Louis, expand kind of liberal logics and notions about how to relate to the state, I think has created a kind of norm in St. Louis where in this moment it feels really difficult to like push against that. But I think the way that the spectacle sort of operated in that moment, and I think operates in crisis periods that people, you know, that we can see in the United States over and over again, I think was really instructive and really clarifying to see laid out. The question that I have is sort of about the way you sort of think about and talk about or will write about Blackness in the book and how I feel like I came across a lot of instances of that seemed as though it was implying that Blackness in and of itself operated in relation to the state, separate from the way that we understand Blackness um, as like being formed or understood through like capital or property. So I asked Dylan if you were an Afro-pessimist as for context. He also laughed and told me to ask you. So it's kind of like a jumbled question. So it's like not necessarily like, are you an Afro-pessimist, right? But like, I guess my question is sort of about how you see Blackness functioning in the text as like, I don't know if this is like a, Dylan, do you know what I'm trying to ask?
Keep talking. No, no, this is good. This is good. Just
Mm,
talk through it. Think through it. This is what Damien's here
um,
for.
yeah, I guess I don't know how, I guess I was less clear. I think there were several parts where things were ascribed to um Blackness that I was sort of like, do you mean Blackness in and of itself, or do you mean Blackness specifically as it relates to like how the state understands Blackness, as opposed to like Blackness as this amorphous thing, right? Um,
You were talking, Jackie, you were talking about the legibility, illegibility thing.
oh,
That's what it was.
yeah. Uh, yeah, I guess yeah, so that's kind of where I was coming, um, because there's some parts too where you talk about Blackness as being obviously in the conversation in the beginning, you're talking about Blackness as being relegated to the non-human. In that section, you also talk about Blackness as being therefore illegible. And I think you can be both non-human and still legible to the state through, like, if you are non-human because you are capital or understood as capital, you're non-human but still legible to the state in that way. Whereas illegibility to me more closely aligns to the way that you describe fugitivity or a conversation about marronage or the sort of like um, not and it not against the state, but like outside of how the state even understands its own landscape. Those weren't questions, but
No, no, can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'll start off by saying two things first. One is thank you, Dylan, for that introduction. That was fantastic. It really means a lot. I didn't realize it's been over 20 years since we've known each other. But it indeed has. So thank you for that so much. Jackie, thank you so much for that question, that read, the analysis. because that's in many ways what I was trying to tease out and trying to work through myself. And I think as a way to get at it, if you take that sort of anecdote of the spectacle that you mentioned before, and think of the ways in which the state is constantly reacting to formations of Blackness that are not legible to it. So as a example of that, 1992, the uprising that takes place, the city of LA, the official city of LA meets with the county board of supervisors, who then meet with the LA Times, it's sort of like the propaganda arm. And they come up with a whole new multiracial plan of how LA should look. It's specifically so that uprisings led by formations of Blackness that are not legible don't happen again. This is their pure intent, right? And it's mapped out. Jerome Vargas has an excellent piece that talks about this and how this is in response. And I use it as an example, but you can see moments of this that are happening all throughout the city's history, right? So it happens in a spectacle way, 1965, the exact same things happens with Watts. But during that interim time period from 65 through 92, the state is constantly in reaction mode to Blackness that can't be seen or heard. There's state structures that are built and formed to try to house, enclose upon this Blackness throughout school systems, mental health systems, housing systems. The state is constantly trying to encroach and gain power because of these organizing efforts that are taking place that, quite frankly, the state has no idea how or why they're forming. And so they're trying to figure out which is why I say that it's highly reactionary. So to answer the question about Blackness in the book in terms of how it's being used, when I use the term majority of Blackness, that's in reference to the state co-optation efforts that are taking place to try to map out what Blackness should look like. There's a particular class, race, sex sort of model that's being developed. And so you can clearly see that, for example, with the mayoral tenure of Tom Bradley, who becomes like the exemplar of what Blackness should be within the city. Anything that rests outside of that is a problem. So it's during that time period where you see arrest of Black sex workers skyrockets. This thing about gangs skyrockets. All these things that are mapping Blackness as being what sociologists would say deviant, but is really being illegible to the state, because this, in fact, are the avenues and ways in which being exceeds the boundaries of the human within the capital sense. And so that has to be recognized, that it has to be enclosed upon, because we can't have this, because these formations are operating outside of those normative boundaries in which capital can't put its hands upon. Now it tries desperately to do that. It in a consistent manner, either through co-optation or sheer brutal violent force. So I hope that gets at your question, because that was a fantastic question. Thank you so much for that.
Damien, let me jump in here, because when Jackie was talking and thinking through this in the opening part of our discussion, I had to come clean to everybody that I read this book when it was in manuscript form, and I had to finesse our editor, and say, nah, it's not a conflict of interest. I can give this, a thoroughly, jarringly critical read, which I happily did, and I enjoyed talking through this with you as we went. Can you remind me, or maybe you can just think through this in real time now? I remember that we had an extended set of conversations about your book in which we talked about Blackness as an archive, as a speculative archive in particular. And then you remarking on that in the years since, so this is 2022, I think I first read the manuscript. So in the years following, when we talk about this book, but even when we talk about Joy and Pain and when we just talk generally, when we think together generally, we think about Blackness as an archive constantly in the making. So maybe you can share with people how you've thought about that over this period of time as you you know, as you completed this book, and maybe even in relation to Joy and Pain, the book that you finished right before this one.
Sure, yeah. So I think if you think about Blackness as an archive, it's definitely from the epistemological point of view, which is that the knowledge making that takes place, these traditions that are both passed down through generations, but also importantly through community formations, are constantly being reinvented, mapped upon certain parts of the city in ways that the state attempts to corral, and that's dangerous. It's very dangerous, right? And so to take it in the context of like a school, um, you can see what happens in 1965 when Black organizations begin to take control over the organizing efforts through both public secondary schools, high schools, and then also universities within Los Angeles. And they begin to reshape how the schools function and operate. And then in turn, it begins to, as it's always been, I would argue, blur that line between education happening in one place and not happening in another place and being a constant continuum. This is important because as that moment begins to take hold and formations of knowledge get passed down, it's like of terms of what is correct, ways of how you should be when someone tries to come across your face with a Molotov cocktail, which is exactly what was happening in 1963, 64 at Fremont High School at Washington Prep, or Washington High School got turned to the Washington Prep, as white parents are attacking Black students and their parents because they don't want them there at these schools. The counterformation to that, in terms of like this Black archival knowledge, is like, no, we're not going to take this. Like, this is not going to be any sort of sit down, let's let the law handle it, because there's understanding that, in fact, the law is on the side of these white parents, because this is how the law is made up. We come from Texas, we come from Louisiana, we come from Mississippi, and we already understand the legal sort of doctrine that governs all this. So instead, we form our own organizations, which are going to protect us, which are going to, and also provide the sense of knowledge that's going to be needed in order to build something else differently. The state, in a reactionary posture, then tries to corral that and tries to, in its own sense, have a. This is one of the points that I try to make in the book, which is that the notion of carcerality itself is an archival formation, in which it tries and attempts to map out all these ways of Black knowledge and stop them, either through violent means, as I said before, like physical brute force, or through formations of cooptation, because they don't understand what's going on. And they're trying to get a glean or a glimpse of it as an effort in order to change it, sort of like in a viral sense, from the inside out, right? But that never works. Like history has shown, that never ever works. But yet that's the attempt.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I was trying to think through with you for the last several years, and so that's it unfolds really well in this, really beautifully in this book, and I think it stokes these kind of conversations in an ongoing, perpetual way. But that's part of I think what you were getting at. I think Susie's going to come back to this later, but in thinking about Blackness as an ongoing unfolding, as a making, as something that is locked into various kinds of antagonism. But I thought it was really interesting that Jackie brought that question forward in the preliminary discussion. I mean, I had an involuntary reaction to it.
Well, I think the other thing, like, I was ducking Jackie's question about the Afro pessimism question as well. I laughed because I would say, like, no, I'm not an Afro pessimist. And Dylan and I can talk at length about why that is for a whole bunch of reasons, right? I would say that I'm actually, I don't know if it comes through in the book, but I'm wildly optimistic, right? And what I mean by that is, in a sense of radicalism as a formation, being able to dictate the sort of the long game here, which is, I think there's to a certain extent there has to be an understanding that the controls of empire are short-lived, and that the longue durée, so to speak, of Blackness is infinite. That is my sort of like basis of it, right? And the basis of it comes from an understanding of the inherent power within Black culture throughout the world, and the formations of that politics that are inherent within that culture to supersede any intervention that the state attempts to map upon it. And so it's just like a matter of time for these things to, well, time is a whole nother like phrase, but a matter of when empires do indeed fall, like they crumble, they die. And that crumbling and dying is because it cannot hold Black radicalism.
Yeah, right on, right on. No, one of the things that I'm going to pass it to Kim, and I want to say how much I appreciate that you included, and we read this together before you came on with us, which was the Statement of Fugitive Archives, Southern California Library, right here in the beginning of the book. I think that really meshes well with what you just said. So folks who have this book or who get this book, take a look at page 10, 11, and 12 to think about fugitivity in terms of archive. Kim, I'm going to pass it to you.
Just a quick note about the fugitivity printout that you included in the book. We've received emails at the library asking like if we could provide the copy to like a lot of researchers, and we're just like, get it from the book. I don't know. Like it's the same thing. I don't understand why you need it from us. But my questions come from having spent the last 8 months at the library as the inaugural postdoc in residence, or whatever my title that I made up is. And in working there, I really like, you get the spirit of the library pretty fast. I feel like I completely disarmed myself when I met Yusuf. I was like, this is all my baggage, this is all my drama, da da da. Like, am I still okay here? And he was like, yes, like, I'm right. They mean it when they mean anti-carceral. They mean fugitivity when they say fugitivity. And to that, we've been spending a lot of time organizing the archives and packaging books. And I think a lot about how there's so much, and in tandem with what Christina Vispera said about how no knowledge project is innocent, I think about what is the bridge work that people like us, right? People who are invested in knowledge production, circulation, and dissemination need to do in order to make text accessible, not only, right, like physically accessible, but also accessible to people who don't have a college education or aren't able to, dedicate 3 hours a day to read something. And then my second question is, what happens when, I'm curious to know what happens, or what your experiences have been when fugitivity and illegibility come into the economy of academia. And here I'm really thinking about the way that you write about how abolition is taken up, right, so easily as a set value, but not necessarily in practice. And what we were talking about before was organizations such as Community Coalition that really engage with projects that you've talked about in your other books, like Weed and Seed, or community policing programs, right, that determine that, like you were saying, right, we want the legible form of Blackness and not people who use drugs, not sex workers, not people who are connected to any gangs. Yeah.
Thank you. And Kim, it's good to see you again, although it's virtual this time. So for the first question, let's see if I make sure this is the question about accessibility. Is that right? Okay. So it's funny that you mentioned that, because Yusuf was sort of one of the first people, Yusuf Omawali from the Southern California Library, who was one of the first people to like really hammer home that we need propaganda from our side of things. And I think that's very important for that. And I think in particular, what helps are formations such as this, right? Reading groups, large collection of people who are their goal is to learn and to sort of engage in Black study itself. And I mention that because some of the key sort of learning parts for me that took place, as Dylan said that he met me in grad school, was during my field work when I got to work with Michael Zinzin, and who was from the Southern California chapter of the Black Panther Party. And he pretty much broke down to me like the structure of what needed to happen based upon the Black Panther model, which was study groups and learning, right? And they were going in reading pretty dense theory, ranging from like the classic theory of like Marx that we think of from, all the volumes of Capital, all the way up to postmodern theory itself. With the whole understanding is that there's a way to have to understand how the state and how the West moves and operates. So then when we go out and do our programs, we can then have the tactical and strategic information that's needed in order to move. And I think that same type of device and structure is needed on the side of radicalism itself, right? And so I think this goes back to being wildly optimistic. It's because I do believe that those formations are happening. It's just a way of trying to amplify them so that they reach a much broader audience, right? So maybe like 15, maybe 10 years ago, there was sort of like the rise of zines and zine culture that came about that was really exposing the multi-layerness of sort of the prison industrial complex, and to really have like a very much a very bare bone understanding, but yet a powerful understanding of how prisons function and operate. And I think that same type of messaging still needs to get out there. Now, this is where I'm a little bit conflicted as to the how part of it, in large part because I don't trust social media. And what I say when I say that I don't trust it is I've had conversations with my good friend Orsami Burton, who has said again and again that COINTELPRO wishes it had come up with Facebook. It wishes it had come up with Instagram. It wishes it had come up with Twitter, because there's so much, in fact, of how it operates and how it moves that just gives full information autonomy authority over to the state without even thinking about it. And so I think there's a way to engage with social media in that way, perhaps, but I'm wildly skeptical at the same time that is the conduit. And I only say that because oftentimes when people think about accessibility, they immediately jump to like YouTube or Instagram or any of these TikTok. And I think we have to sort of think outside of those parameters and go back to like the bare bones of actually building up these infrastructures that are already in place. And so there's places like the Southern California Library, for example, who are doing that same type of work, but there's a whole host of other places that are also doing the same thing. And I think that like there has to be another teleological logic that forms from this in order to map out how an educative process can develop through those pathways. And I don't know if necessarily I'm sometimes hesitant on taking the models of the past because they could work, but these have to be flipped. Like I think about what the Panthers did. The Panthers used to host parties on Friday and Saturday nights, and then sort of sprinkle in there, like, stop the music and be like, hey, we're having a meeting on such and such day, everybody come through, right? And then get the party back and going again, right? That model could work still, right? It seems very simple, bare bones, but in fact, that led to organizing efforts all over the whole world in that way, right? Um, yeah. So I'm still thinking through of like those very fundamental base tactics, but I think that I agree with you. I think that the propaganda has to be sort of turned on high at this moment because that's really what is needed in order to sort of get the messaging out there. I feel like that doesn't fully address your question on accessibility, and I guess to be honest, this book itself, I wasn't sure if the question was addressed to about this book at all, but because sometimes I get that like, well, this book is not accessible, right? And I think there's a way in which we have to make like the notion of theoretical text, I guess you'd say, how that actually is accessible. Because like I said, my whole grounding was from the Panthers, right? The Panthers were doing these were like, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids all the way up to 65-year-old people who are all in reading groups learning together. And I think that's fundamental to it. So as a back way to get at that question, I think accessibility has to be mapped out through Black study. And that's the way that it can be answered. Now, there was the second question. I'm completely blanking on that now. I should have wrote this down. I apologize. If you could repeat that
Yeah.
again, I appreciate it.
And it wasn't at all in relation to your book. I think your book, because it's short, I have ADHD, so I like you lose me if it's too long. But the fact that like your book and Max Felter Cantor's book both use the Kappa collections, but in wildly different ways, I think speaks to what my classmates were talking about in terms of your writing was very much read as studying with the archives instead of like teaching us about the archives, if that makes sense. So I'm like not personal to your book at all. My second question was, what happens when fugitivity and illegibility come into the economy of academia? And this is really a question that I've been, I think, asking a lot of our participants based on my own anxieties. And again, Christina Vespera's sort of comment that echoes in me when she says no knowledge project is innocent. And I think also speaking to how you're very much intentional about thinking about knowledge projects outside of academia and what that looks like in third spaces like the library.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So maybe I can answer this in two parts. The first is Cedric Robinson told me right before I started my first gig, he said the university is merely your base of operations. He said, have no investment in that place whatsoever. It is just, it allows you to get material items that you need in order to do the projects that you really want to do. And that has stuck with me. That was in 2011. So I forgot quick math on that, right? And that has been consistent because at every single turn, the university will either co-opt what it is that you do, chew you up and spit you out in various ways, and can quite literally make you vitally ill in ways that there is no coming back from, can kill you in other terms, right? It could be like a slow death. So the investment in that project is very harmful to your own well-being, right? At that same time, I believe that's the sort of nature of work and labor in the capital sense, right? So the academia sometimes is put in this pedestal of being like this utopic spot where everybody is engaged there to to learn. And as my conversation, Dylan and Ori or Sammy Berman have really pushed me on this, which is that academia is a site of warfare and is a key, it has always been a critical site of warfare. And you can sort of take that and understand how that works at multiple levels. It's regional. There's models that are developed. It helps, not helps, it is the basis of how capital operates and functions. If you understand it then in that context, then the engagement within it changes drastically, right? So I think that's like the first part. The second part of it is that the this notion of fugitivity, I don't know, I have like mixed feelings about it, right? In terms of how it operates within the academic space, which is on one hand, I think is impossible for fugitivity to operate within an academic space, purely because the notion of fugitivity is getting outside the clutches of the state. That's on one hand, right? So teachers can be fugitive, administrators can be fugitive. Like there's nothing in that uh, framework that's fugitive at all, because you're still within the confines of the state itself, and you're still operating as an agent of capital. I think it importantly then it's for us to also recognize that the notion of fugitivity is intentionally liminal, which is that it doesn't have a long-term plan, right? It's sort of like an in-between stage to get to that somewhere else. And I think that if we keep that in mind when talking about fugitivity, it then allows us to, as a constant reminder that we have to build this other place and as a spot to get to. And so we can't, sometimes there's like this praising of the fugitive as like the model that we should ascribe to, as opposed to understanding that it's literally a strategy towards liberation that's needed, as opposed to like a way station as a desirable model slash location of being. And that was very critical for me to understand that. In fact, in understanding how when Dylan was talking about that study group that we were working with, that's in fact as Kim, as you said in the chat there, the strategy of survival for many of those people in the study group was just that, operating outside of the boundaries of the state, but yet not having a permanent sort of space to land to work, right? So it allowed them, it gave them space to like breathe, but there wasn't any, I wouldn't say having a fugitive disposition did not provide for long-term life chances, strategies, so on, to that extent.
Damien, can maybe I'll jump in here as well and add to what Kim brought up, which is something I reflected on with the group, was how you, Yusef, Michelle, have been so consistent and principled in enacting the library as a critical, analytical, community-based archive, a clearinghouse of sorts for evaluating and analyzing surrounding configurations of organizational forces that might be advancing the counterinsurgent and surveillance-based net of kind of liberal and progressive arms of the state and of the nonprofit apparatus, as Kim brought up, and also of academic entrepreneurs. You know, the kind of the long-running tension, as well as periodic symbiosis that the library has with professional intellectuals of various kinds, but especially academics, especially professional intellectuals who are employed by universities as researchers, who have far too frequently had an extractive and exploitive and opportunistic relationship with the library. So could you talk about that at the level of a self-determined politics for the library? Because there's so many apparatuses, especially archives, places that see themselves as archives, that would not subject their so-called clientele, right, meaning university employed researchers, to such serious critical political scrutiny, right? But that is precisely what differentiates Southern California Library and the work of this book from conventional academic approaches to research and archive. So could you just talk about that for a minute, and then I'm going to throw it over to Susie.
So yeah, I definitely think that the politics that the library has with respect to the notion of the archive is one that creates a radically different type of space than the traditional archive, because there's an understanding. This goes back to the conversation from the first question that Jackie posed. There's an understanding that the state has various structures whose intent and function is to archive Black life. And that archive of Black life is meant to subject Black people to various forms of violence needed, necessarily so that capital can sort of do its thing, right? The the notion of the the making of knowledge in a very specific and determined way, even from the labeling of categories, is very much an intentional aspect of it, right? And an intentional formation, all the way to the other end, which is, perhaps is one of the most powerful aspects of the state-based archive, which is the silencing as well, right? So the silencing of knowledge traditions that take place, and very much intentionally so. The way that the Southern California Library has operated under the directorship of Michelle Welsling and Yusuf Omawali is to explode that, and to a certain extent, turn that on its head. And what I mean by that is that there is an opening of space to those formations which otherwise would be deemed illegible, but not exploitative. And what I mean by that is that you would have, I think, I don't want to name names, perhaps we can, but there are several archival formations which should be all too happy to say, like, this is our sex work archive. This is the collection that we have for people who have been incarcerated. This is where we celebrate, the work and the life of such and such who's been in prison for the last 30 years, right? That type of thing is done all the time. But how and what do you do, and how do you do it? How do you curate and with care, with extreme care and extreme level of critical attention paid to the making of an archive that reflects the Blackness that is not bounded by the state? How do you make sort of normal this understanding of this illegible formation in the way that Black people live? How do you then create a collection of knowledge traditions that reflect that? Well, in order to do that, one of the key things that you have to do is to make sure that the people who are accessing the archive have an understanding of what this space is. That's A. But then importantly, B, understand that what you're doing with these collections, you have to be very explicit that when you use these collections in a certain way, you're doing a certain type of work. And that certain type of work has a politics that's embedded within it. And that's made very plain. You're not going to get that if you go to any other archival space that I know of that sort of has a direct affiliation with a university, for example. The sort of understanding is that you're doing the Lord's work, right? And that you're going out and using this as a way to build up a particular set of knowledge that's going to pretty much do what is needed in order for capital to maintain itself. Now, I would say this is hard. Like, the labor that goes into making a formation like that is very difficult, because it's so easy to fall into the trappings that are already sort of laid out there for you. Like I said, there's naming categories at very easy to do that, but then there's also lots of material rewards for doing that type of thing. It would be very easy for the library, for any formation, actually, for us as academics, to get lots of money for saying, like, oh yeah, I'm doing a project on such and such, from sex workers who were incarcerated, that were kicked out of school. Man, I mean, it's like that there's money there for that, right? But if you're doing a project that wants to explode those terms, that wants to say, like, in fact, this notion of sex work shouldn't be considered to be deviance under the terms that you're describing deviance. This notion of education, in fact, is the problem that leads to uh, women who are made vulnerable by the state is directly connected to these formation of education that you put in place. There's not money for that, right? To do that type. As a matter of fact, people are trying to say that that's not legible in of itself. It's not worthy of study, so on and so forth, right? These are the type of projects that the library is putting at the forefront of those that need to sort of be manifested in order for knowledge traditions to be made sort of known at the same time as organizing the notion of like Black life itself to be made plain. And so there's projects of, for example, I've met so many people who are doing projects on like Black roller skaters, for example, throughout Linwood, Inglewood, all the woods sort of that are out there in Southern California, in order to not just like contain that, right, but actually map it out in a formation that is understood as inherently Black. And inherently Black meaning not to be exploited, made into some like roll bounce type of movie that can sort of be sold and watched nationwide, but to understand the politics behind roller skating culture that then break down the sex, gendered class norms that we think are inherent. Because once you begin to do that, you realize that it's these formations of culture that then lead to 65, that then lead to 1992. These are the hubs. If you don't understand that, then you're missing the big picture of where radicalism actually develops and comes from. I remember, I'm gonna say this, and I'm gonna shut up real quick, but I never forget, I was at American Studies meeting, and this had to be 2012 or 13. And I remember this guy from Columbia University, esteemed university, who said that no revolution ever started with a song, right? And it was in direct consternation to talk about how revolution actually works and how it maps out. It's that type of thinking that then becomes undone with a simplicity, right? Of understanding Black life is very much, it's antithetical to even, he would consider himself to be like on the left side of things, right? But even to white radicalism is very much outside of those bounds in of itself. And so going back to Jackie's question, maybe this is why I'm not an Afro pessimist, because I'm really into studying like double Dutch, into studying roller skate, right? I don't think Afro pessimism really would be that much into studying that. That's actually, by the way, that's a whole side conversation that me and Dylan had from way back, but it just made me think about that. So maybe another time we can discuss that at length some more.
I'm gonna throw it to Susie, but I also just wanted to add that if you follow Damien's work, then you understand that Black liberation as praxis is a fucking song, right? Like your last book was organized as a sequence of albums, so it actually is a song. So our guy from Columbia is just on the wrong. They're on a different dimension from the rest of us. Go ahead, Susie.
Hi, Damien. Thanks again for your book. It was actually recommended to me last year by Richard Morrison, and so I was really glad that Dylan, brought us together to talk about it. And I was thinking about the question that you asked in the book on page 75. What are the life-affirming possibilities when confronting a structural apparatus that is designed to destroy the constitutive elements of life itself? And like how you structured the question itself, because I was really most interested in your theoretical understanding of power and as you presented it in the book. And Dylan said that you could answer this question that I'm about to ask in 30 seconds. So, but let me tell you what it is that I saw, and then you could break it down and destroy it in 30 seconds. But to me, I saw it in a very oppositional frame, because you have a Western epistemological tradition versus a Black communal knowledge production. And we were talking about this in the class before you came. And one of the things that I neglected to tell my fellow students is that I'm really interested in the concept of complicity. Like, this is one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And because and so I was really interested in how you structured this idea of power, because I'm trying to think about where is the space outside of power from which we could critique, right? So I think people have been kind of saying interesting things that I want to get to, but this is the way that I understood it while I was reading your book. If Blackness is, as you said, quote, situated as an oppositional impossibility, isn't it therefore, by its very definition, part of the Western epistemological tradition? Like the difference between madness and civilization, the two go together. So this I totally understood. You could tell me that this is wrong reading, that Blackness is that like the refusal of the Western epistemological tradition to recognize itself, that it actually acts as a mirror to the self. But then somehow in your book, particularly because you bring in, if it had remained there, I would have never had this question, but you bring in what you call a, hold on a second, Black communal knowledge production. You also call it sometimes Black radical traditions or Black lived experience. And I was like, where it, in opposition to that, this kind of autonomous Black knowledge production, like that's held in the library, the Southern California Library, where, from which space does this emerge? Does it exist before colonialism, slavery, and the state? And if so, would it even have that name? Be Black with a capital B. Like, what is it referring to ontologically in time and space? What is its materiality? And so one of the things that people were talking about, and Jackie brought this up when she talked about essentialism, is that people seem to be suggesting that I'm not thinking of it in the correct way, that Blackness is something that can't be pinned down, that it's like a temporal issue. Like the idea that fugitivity is not a space outside, but is like a place of contestation because power is not all encompassing. Um, and it, and, but what I'm asking is, like, if it is not an identity and it is not essential, then what exactly do you mean when you say the way that Black people live, like Black lived experience, and what is that relationship to the Western epistemological tradition? Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean that I'm gonna say this. The way you explained it made sense to me, but I want to make sure that I am going to answer it in the way in which you meant it. I guess if that makes sense to back to you. And so I guess in a very, I don't know if I have 30 seconds for that, but very simply, it's the way that Black people are identified is at the level of interpolation. So that at that level, this is the formation of the state. And when I say the state, I mean the confluence between the entrance of the sort of formal apparatus of the state with sort of like the private interest that drives capital itself in order to make race seem real. That level of interpolation is not something necessarily that it's not static at all, right? It never has been static. So the notion of like who gets identified as Black changes over space and time, right? It's very much a geographic type of thing. So Blackness is not the same in terms of like the identification of it. It's not the same in the United States as it is in Brazil, as it is in parts of South Africa, East Africa, North Africa, right? Like it changes. So I think that there's a fundamental understanding of that part of it, right? But there's also an understanding that Blackness operates in a way that is needed for capital to actually exist. And so Blackness has to exist at that sort of base level. Otherwise, the whole notion of capital falls apart, right? It just doesn't make sense without it, which is why the whole thing about people of color makes no sense. Because as Jerome Vargas says, once you take away Blackness from that, it just doesn't hold weight at all. It doesn't exists. So Blackness is critical to the fungibility of capitalist existence. Okay. But this notion of Blackness as sort of and how it operates is definitely, it's a social construction. But at the level of the discussion that we're having, this is very much a political formation in of itself, right? So that the notion of how Blackness moves and operates and the adoption of Blackness is a way to understand that there's particular ways in which cohesion of people move throughout what we say the diaspora. I don't know if that word's in vogue anymore. It used to be about 15 years ago, but to my understanding, it is not anymore. So maybe there's another word that's coming in its place. But there's the understanding that Black people carry these traditions that literally can be mapped out across time and space the same way, right? And you can Cedric Robinson does this beautifully in Black Marxism, in which he maps out how Black revolt is the same in West Africa, in Jamaica, in the Southern Hemisphere of North America and Central America, and sort of like the tip of South America as well. These are all the same formations that are taking place, right? These are the epistemology of Blackness is clearly being carried out throughout all of these spaces, right? It then coheres around this term Blackness in terms of what it means and how it operates. The state itself attempts to stop that, attempts to make that unknown, right? And at every single point in turn, it stops from making that point very clear. And I think that becomes this the bifurcation, if you will, between this notion of Blackness as in identity politics, which then gets caught up in this notion of essentialism, as if Black people invented that term themselves, as if Black people are the ones who are responsible for then making sure that they're not called Black, which gets you into this crazy loop that you can't undo because capital clearly needs Blackness, as we said before, in order to operate. So if you want to call capitalism essentialist, okay, then I'm with you on that, right? In terms of how it operates and how it unfolds. But the notion of somehow, some way that Black people themselves are bear the responsibility of undoing the wrath of capitalism is absurd to me, just on its face, right? There's a lot of other work that needs to be done for Black people to exist and not to worry about how the sort of the failures and demise of the absurdity of capital. I say all of that to say, I'll wrap it up with this, which is that the at every single sort of like point and turn, what an adoption of Blackness then represents is in fact a way out of these social constructions that have been put in place. Because the politics that we talked about that exist within the pure, literally diversity. When I say diversity, I'm not talking about like the diversity that's pops around universities, but the pure diversity that exists within Black spaces represents the possibility of what could be. And what could be, I mean, like exploding these notions of gender, sexuality, and race that are already in existence, right? And we don't necessarily have to go somewhere and undo them. One of the points of intervention that is made in Black Marxism is that white academics were so hell-bent on identifying some sort of utopic radical praxis that they would identify as socialism or whatever, completely ignoring that Black communities had already been living in these spaces that exploded all those categories for eons. And this becomes the way, in fact, if you want to get rid of essentialism, which means get rid of, like if you're actually well-intentioned on that matter, I don't believe a lot of people are. I think people are trying to create some sort of trap in order to fall into so that you can't organize. But if you, and I'm not saying you, but by that, in terms of like there's a long history of this. If you want to get out of that, then in fact, you have to immerse yourself within Blackness in order to do it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I'm thinking about what would be the answer to the question that you asked and actually this may be in the podcast or the book that you did for millennials are killing capitalism, because I may be mixing them up. But at a certain point you asked, how do we get to the point where you have organizations that are led by Black people calling the cops on their community? And I was wondering, like, what was the answer that you gave to yourself about how that happened?
Now that I can't answer in 30 seconds, which is that's needed in order for capital to survive, right? That's purely a modality of co-optation in
Okay.
of itself, right? So that when I talk about like that Tom Bradley model that followed,
Yes.
Tom Bradley literally was the chief of police of Los Angeles, right? And you make these people who follow in this case, a very specific class and gendered formation as the epitome of what Blackness should be.
Yes.
Everything else falls into that category of being illegible and therefore dangerous and therefore needs to be enclosed upon. So then within that, of course, it makes sense that anything that doesn't follow these particular models, this is the exact same thing with my brother's keeper that happened during the Obama administration, is you create these policies that supposedly are coming from the Black community, but are not. These are things that have been invented by the coalescence of the church and private capital in order to make it look like it's coming from something that happens within Black. Oh, hello, can you hear me? I'm sorry. I think it was
Yes.
froze there for a second. That is making it look like it's happening from within Black communities themselves. And so this question of the sort of facilitation of that type of logic is very old. Like that goes
Yeah.
back to the plantation, right? Like it's an old formation, but it continually tries to get mapped onto context over time because capital is constantly responding to Blackness, so it has to constantly try to work its way out. That was only 30 seconds. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. I'm just gonna leave with two questions, but you don't have to answer them now. One was, what do you think about Project 2025? Because this is a political project that pretends to dismantle the structures of the state that are coming from the right. And then the second is, are the collections that you talk about in the Southern California Library, is that not an archive? Is archive a specific word that you're using, or is it carceral archive, that those two together? But would you not call because people have been using library and collections and archive kind of interchangeably and then different. And I was just wondering, what you thought about those terms. But you don't have to answer them now. I know that people have other questions and we wanted to get to Jesse.
15 seconds. Project 2025 is purely the manifestation of fascism that's been in existence in this country since its formation. It's just someone put it down on paper, very clear. The second thing is I try to make a distinction, probably not very well, but that is my goal, to make a distinction between the state formation of archive versus knowledge formation that comes from Black communities.
That was easy. That was easy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. So I'm going to ask Jesse and Brianna to go back to back here. Maybe they can bring their questions up together, because I want to be mindful of our time. And then maybe we'll close out with Uriel's question as our outro. So Jesse, you go, and then right after Jesse goes, Brianna, you can unmute and you can ask your question too.
Okay, I'm going to try to make this brief. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed the text. As someone who's not currently in an academic setting beyond this experimental study, I did find it accessible, and something I was reflecting on in the earlier part of our session was the way that I felt that you engaged in a mode of collective study with the reader, and in that way kind of mirrored the kind of collective study practice that I felt like you were reflecting on the Panthers and Kappa doing. So I really appreciated that, and that came through even more. And when I heard you speak on millennials are killing capitalism, that you really do engage with, the reader and the consumer of this text as a co-conspirator. So I have a couple questions. Again, I'll try to make it quick. My first one is, so just quickly situating myself as an organizer who identifies as anarchist leading. I'm also a trans person, and I'm geographically based in Miami, Florida, so a place where there's lots of trans antagonism and also general political antagonism. So I'm curious how you feel or hope this text exists in the modern moment as the technologies of the Carceral archive continue to sharpen and rear their head. I'm thinking particularly, well, I'll just leave it there. And then the second question that Dylan encouraged me to ask is if you could reflect at all on your relationship to anarchism, particularly Black anarchism, and how you feel those ideologies resonate or don't not resonate with your work and with your politic and work. I'll pass it over to Brianna.
Go ahead, Brianna.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet some of you. I'm super excited to be here. Just trying to create a moment to note those questions because mine are also meaty. I put mine in the chat. I have two. And my questions are about the problem at the bedrock of anti-Blackness as an analytic. And in my own understanding, and I also saw throughout the book, there are continuity of principles that have expressions that repeat and then get rearranged to maintain the myth of its integrity, right? And you give us examples in technology, among the mothers, right, in schooling. And so I wanted to return to your thinking about different kinds of archives and proposing something I've been thinking about, which is an archetypal study of anti-Blackness, in that there are value systems, a hierarchy of values at its core that get expressed in a myriad number of ways. And so I had questions about that and thinking about Blackness as something that is grafted rather than rooted and a clear return, but a grafted and like improvisation and constant creation from two seemingly incongruous or disparate things and making something new. So I'm going to try and choose one. I am going to go with the archetypal study. And so I'm thinking about Robinson's arguments about order and Winter's arguments about the human. And so I'm curious how carcerality as an archetype of anti-Blackness helps you understand sovereignty as a particular kind of archetype, statecraft as an archetype of war, and if the collective Black body, I'm still saying Black diaspora, I don't know if folks are using that, but if the collective Black body is the Black diaspora, what kind of principle would you add to an anti-archival study of the archetypes of anti-Blackness? So they're jumbled. There's a huge paragraph in the chat. If that's confusing, I tried to blend them, but my questions are bouncing between those elements. Thanks.
And is there one more question as
Well,
well?
you can go ahead. I think that's probably just enough for you to respond.
Just enough.
And then we'll close out with one more person after this.
Okay, I'm gonna
Yeah.
try to answer these questions concisely because these are great questions, man. Like this is a great, fantastic group. I must say that after like every single question has been great. I can tell you guys are serious about your study and your reading, and this has been a very refreshing because you don't come across this all the time at all. So thank you so much for that. Okay, I'm gonna try to answer these questions to the best of my ability. And to make sure that I understood all the details of them as well. All right, so I'll start with Brianna first. So I think a way to get at that question is what I attempted to do in the text, which is to explode this notion of, if you want to say carcerality or the prison industrial complex, as being something that is confined to a nation state environment. And specifically, when you are talking about the United States in this context, there was an attempt to, as abolition became a thing, there was an attempt to make uh, if you want to say like the archival knowledge of what prisons are to be wrapped up in a sort of a neat bow, and to say like that's a physical warehousing unit that takes place in these particular areas because these people have done these things, and maybe it's not the best way that we should go about adjudicating justice. So abolition, therefore, should mean that the structures of justice that are in place just need to be tinkered with a little bit. These physical structures, these warehouses, maybe they aren't the best way to do things. Maybe we can change up where we send these people, but fundamentally, we're not going to alter any of that, right? And I think all of the people who have spoken throughout the course of this course have brilliantly provided insight into the flaws of that. So I'm not necessarily going to go into like those inherent flaws, but important to me for the book was to take up what in fact the collections at the library were saying about the buildup of the prison industrial complex itself, which was that it is very much tied to particular threads, needs, demands of capital in order for capital to exist. These demands, threads, needs do not exist within nation states. They are international sort of in scope intentionally. And so when we map out, for example, the same processes in order to have oil extraction, this is the point I'm trying to make in the text, that take place in Nigeria, those are the same tactics in play, in fact, that are being used for oil extraction in Southern California. The organizations such as CAPA, such as the LA chapter of Black Panther Party, were intentionally making those points known. So that if you're talking about undoing the carceral infrastructure in the United States, implicitly you have to talk about undoing oil extraction by these multinational corporations throughout the world, because it's the same factors that are at play. And they get into literally the strategies, the employment, the manipulation of through propaganda, through the education systems, in order to make that look natural and look real. On one hand, but then the same tactics, like the bolstering up of state processes as the only modicum by which freedom could be had in order to go through your legislative system, blah, 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 in order to like undo these quote unquote systems, was in fact a farce. And the farce was because it was all sort of mapped out in the first place for this notion of the civic. And that understanding of being a human and being a civic is all tied to state structures. So blowing all of that up, because this is what the knowledge that's coming directly from these collections are saying is necessary. So to get to your point about anti-Blackness and how it works throughout the diaspora, there has to be an intimate sort of level of Black study in order to understand how all these points are relational. So that when we're talking about formations, it is indeed a regional phenomena in terms of how it operates, right? But the logics of capital are not regional, right? The logics of capital, in fact, are to model and to scale up. and thus to use those same formations that happens. If it works in the Delta of Mississippi, it should work in the Delta of Nigeria as well. And let's use that same models, right? But that particular formation of modeling and scaling up that take place, that's a Western phenomenon that cannot account for Black radicalism. And that's the point I was trying to make in the book, is that there's an anticipation, there's a knowledge that this is back in the 1960s, right? And early 70s, before prisons begin to sort of explode throughout the United States. There's already anticipation that this is going to happen because there's an understanding of how capital works and operates. The sort of the modicum of the West through Western traditions cannot anticipate that because of their failures to reckon with Blackness, which is what we spoke about earlier before. So that any reckoning with Black study then, which engages sort of in this rupture of the notions of modeling, scaling up, the state of so be it, inherently is going to address the anti-Blackness that is implicit within these particular projects. So I hope that answers the question. And of course, we can talk because that was a fantastic question. So I feel like it's not doing it the justice that it deserves, but that was a very much excellent question. Jesse, can you, I have already forgotten the question because you asked about, I think, if I remember correctly, you were asking about the sort of the sharpening of carcerality within this particular moment. Is that right? But I feel like there was something else to that I'm missing.
No, you got it. I mean, I'm just curious from a personal perspective how you feel or hope the text functions in this moment as the carceral archive and the carceral state does continue to sharpen. I'm thinking particularly about kind of tracking mechanisms that are put in place, whether through social media, like you mentioned, or through self-disclosure formats such as like gender markers on IDs. There's this big panic right now in Florida for everybody to change their trans folks to change their gender marker before it's illegal. And this text had me thinking a lot about the implications of archiving ourselves in that way and how the state might be able to manipulate those archives.
Yeah, so I think, like, man, I think about this so much when in particular in the archives of COPPA and the LA chapter of Black Panther Party, and Dylan and I, when we were with that collection going through that study group, it's so clear that they are marking this coalescence between the state and private capital around these issues of technology as being a potential harbinger of what the state is attempting to do in the future, right? And I think the reliance, this is outside of like AI conversations. I'm not even talking about that, right? I'm talking about explicitly about what you're, Jesse, what you're referring to, which is the needing of the state to sort of hide behind technology as a I can't say that word as a public good. Um, but really its intent, in fact, is to archive. And that became very clear with the first computer system that was put in place with the LA County Sheriff's Department and the LAPD, was directly as a way to try to stop these organizations from finding out how, in fact, it was that the LA County Sheriffs and the LAPD were spying upon them. And so you hide behind this sort of relic of technology. That was the intent. Like that literally, it's spelled out. They had this contract with JPL and Motorola in order to make this happen. I think importantly, it's not so much of, and I understand it's exactly what the question is in terms of like what the book is doing. I think what I'm hoping that the book is doing is pushing us to look back at that knowledge tradition that was sort of the letting us know that these things have ill intent behind them. My fear and concern is that as we move away, further and further away from that particular moment in time, that we lose that knowledge. And I'm hoping that the that knowledge is spread out as wide and as much as possible. This gets to the question that Kim was asking about propaganda. How do we make that then known as a thing, right? When I remember talking with Phyllis Jackson. Phyllis Jackson used to teach at the Claremont Colleges and was a member of the LA chapter of Black Panther Party. And we had a conversation. This was back in 2011, 2012. And she was like, don't get on Facebook, stay off of Facebook. And I was like, why? I don't understand. Phyllis, right? You know, I'm just like, hey, all my friends on Facebook. She's like, nope, that is an agent of the state. Get off of there. Do not trust that, you know, for X, Y, and Z reasons. I think a lot of people my age and my peers will look at that as being, as Ori would say, not to say that I'm not saying this word as it's about to come off cross, but as being conspiratorial, when in fact it is just that, right? Like it is literally the intent and function, right? That of why it's going on. And so I think there's a need to make that known as being a problem. Now, I think it helps that we have complete fascists who are leading these companies and they can't help but show their fascist ways. Then that makes them like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be following what Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, like what their vision of the future is completely fucked up. Like you could see it in that how ugly that damn car is that Musk makes, right? He wants to create some sort of Mad Max future of what the world should look like, whereas the rest of us actually are trying to live a life that has meaning. This idiot is trying to literally drive us into the sun. And so I think that helps out on that end of things, right? In terms of just being skeptical of that, right? But I think we need more than skepticism. I think we actually need study in order to make it real. So that's just a long-winded way of saying that propaganda will help us on one end, and the spreading out of those knowledge traditions is vitally important.
I can't think of a better way to proliferate out of this moment in this site, in this geography, and this temporality, and this experiment of study than what you just said, Damien. So thank you. Thank you for coming through. I want to express my love for you. I want to express my love for everybody who came through this study group. I'm looking forward to doing a lot more with you all. So just expect your certificate of completion in your email inbox. Pay attention to your invitation to contribute any contact information you want to share with the group. I just did a share through the Google Sheets thing. If we have trouble with it, just feel free to email me, you all, and I'll make it work. But I'm not going to say bye because we're going to see each other again very soon, I think. So so thank you, Damien. Thank you. As always.
If I could say, man, I'm so jealous because I'm not lying when I said before, this is so dope. What is going on right here? Like, I don't think I don't. Many things in my life at this moment have extreme value, and like I'm very particular about where I spend my time in this particular moment. This has been more than worth my time. The questions were so great. You guys just like it really is impactful for the type of investment that you guys have in this course. And like this is a model that we do talk, like it has to be used for furtherance, right? Because of the university is trying to encroach upon how we learn and how we think about things. So I appreciate you, Dylan, for inviting me. I appreciate meeting everybody who asks questions, everybody put questions in the chat. This is beautiful, man. Like this is truly beautiful. So thank you so much.
That right there is what we in the 90s called an outro. So I'm gonna stop talking. That is a fucking outro. Peace, everybody. Love you. See you soon, everyone. Thank you.